Hello, biology buddies. I hope that you are well, your families are well, everybody is staying safe. This is lesson 1 of Unit 1 of GCSE AQA Biology. Unit 1 is called Cell Biology, and in this lesson we are going to have a look at plant and animal cells. I really like this unit and this lesson in particular because it really sets up what most of the GCSE biology is going to be about. So we're going to focus on the content from Unit 1, but we're also going to draw in the links to the other units. So we'll talk about B2, B3, B4, B5, B6, and maybe even a little bit of B7. So we're going to try and make links to the entire GCSE specification just from this first lesson. Looking then at the outcomes for the lesson, we need to recall what a cell is, describe the structures found in plant and animal cells, explain the function of organelles, so those are going to be the cell structures, and compare the structure of plant and animal cells. What are cells? Cells are probably the most important thing in biology. It's one of the unifying grand concepts of biology. The general idea is that every living thing, from bacteria to dinosaurs to plants to insects to humans to jellyfish, they are all made of cells. Different organisms are of course made up of different types of cells. These are called specialized cells, and we'll be looking at them more in lesson 3. And some are made of unspecialized cells, and some animals and plants are a combination of specialized and unspecialized cells. Organelles then are little tiny structures found in cells. We use the word subcellular to mean that they're smaller than cells. They're found in cells. And each of these organelles has specific functions. You'll often see the word cell structure used in the place of organelle, and then when you get to A-level biology, they'll transition towards the word organelle, and that will follow through in university as well. Different cells are going to have different kinds of organelles. They're going to have a different abundance or number of organelles depending on what that cell has to do. We're going to look at this in a lot more detail in lesson 3, which is on the specialized cells. But for example, muscle cells need lots of energy to be able to contract and then relax. So they're going to have lots of mitochondria, because mitochondria are the organelles that release energy through a process called aerobic respiration. Before we begin, and we'll start with the animals, how many different organelles or cell structures can you name already? For those of you doing this lesson as review, you should be able to name 5. For those of you who are doing this from the first time, maybe you've done Key Stage 3 science, you should be able to name quite a few as well. The idea of cell structures comes up quite early in science education. So pause the video here, write down a couple of notes. What are some different organelles that you can name? And then try and have a go at the function. Function is a special word for job. What are the jobs, the functions of those organelles or cell structures that you were able to name? There are lots and lots and lots of organelles, even in animal cells, which are actually in some ways a lot simpler than plant cells. You'll get into more of them at A-level biology, and then even further beyond if you decide to study biology at university. But for GCSE AQA, there are 5 that you need to know. There's the nucleus, the cytoplasm, the mitochondria, that is plural, mitochondrion is the singular, ribosomes, and the cell membrane. How many of those 5 were you able to name? You also need to know the functions for these and be able to relate them to the types of cells that they would be found in. So let's have a look at that in a little more detail. The nucleus contains the genetic material, the DNA of the cell, and it also controls the activities of the cell. So either of those for an answer of what is the function of the nucleus would get you 1 mark. Just to go a little bit deeper for the genetic material, this comes up quite a bit in Unit B6 when we talk about genetics. So within the nucleus, the DNA is organized into long strands called chromosomes. On those chromosomes are specific DNA-based sequences that are genes, and genes are the instructions for making proteins. So this comes up quite a bit in Unit B6. Also, the idea that the nucleus of a body cell and the nucleus of a sex cell or a gamete are going to be different, because a gamete is going to have half the number of chromosomes. So during fertilization, the nucleus of a sperm cell fuses with the nucleus of an egg cell, and that creates, in a human, a typical human, 46 chromosome cell, which then is the zygote, which starts to divide to become the embryo. Then you have all these unspecialized cells that specialize and continue to reproduce through mitosis to make an organism. So the nucleus, super, super, super important. The cytoplasm, for lack of a better word, I like to think of it as the goop that everything else sits in. It's the site of anaerobic respiration and all kinds of other chemical reactions. Anaerobic respiration is going to come up in Unit B4, and anaerobic respiration is respiration without oxygen. Really common mistake in GCSE students is to say that respiration means breathing. Respiration is not breathing. Respiration is a chemical reaction that releases energy, and it happens in all cells. Every time you say that respiration is breathing, there's a biologist somewhere in the world that has a little cry, so try and avoid doing that. The mitochondria is the site of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is also in Unit B4, and aerobic means with oxygen. And this type of respiration is really, really important, especially for complex organisms, because it releases a lot more energy than anaerobic respiration does. So the mitochondria are plural, mitochondrion singular, are organelles within the cell that are responsible for releasing the energy that the cell needs for things like active transport, which we'll see at the end of this unit, building larger molecules like proteins, which we'll see in Unit B6, protein synthesis, also synthesizing other sorts of chemicals like cellulose, which we'll learn about in Unit B4 as well. Ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis. That just means where proteins are made or built, and protein synthesis comes up in Unit B6. And this links together the idea that the base order of DNA in a gene determines the amino acid sequence in a protein, and the order that the amino acids are put in determines the shape and therefore the function of the protein. Those proteins can include, for example, enzymes. Last but not least, we have the cell membrane, which surrounds the cell. A lot of people like to think of it as the skin of the cell. I prefer to think of it as the bouncer or bodyguard of the cell, because one of its main roles is to control what enters and exits the cell. So for example, in most organisms, including humans, one of the things that needs to enter is oxygen for that aerobic respiration. And then something that needs to exit is carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of aerobic respiration and needs to be brought back to the lungs so that it can be exhaled with the air that's exhaled when you breathe out. So those are the 5 organelles that you need to remember for animal cells, generic animal cells. And remember, depending on the function of the cell, what type of specialized cell it is, it's going to have more or fewer of these. So for example, a muscle cell is going to have lots of mitochondria, whereas a red blood cell is one of the few cells that doesn't have a nucleus. And you'll learn about that more in Unit B2 when we talk about the blood and the components of the blood. Okay, let's have a look at plant cells now. Plants have all the same organelles that animal cells have. That should say animals there. My bad. And a few more. So can you name any of the organelles that plants have that animal cells do not have, and give the function for those? I'll give you a clue. The reason that plants are green is because of the presence of a chemical in one of these organelles. Maybe I should put in some music to play in the background while you guys are doing these. Probably won't do that though. Okay, let's have a look. The three that you need to know on top of the nucleus, mitochondria, cytoplasm, ribosome, and cell membrane are the cell wall, the chloroplast, and the vacuole. Now, this is a little bit of a lie here because lots of animal cells have vacuoles as well. We're going to refer to this as a permanent vacuole. Okay, so plant cells have a permanent vacuole. The function of these is pretty straightforward. The cell wall and the vacuole we'll start with really have to do with the stability of the cell. So the cell wall is going to prevent it from bursting outwards, from exploding if it fills up with too much water due to osmosis, which we'll look at in a later lesson in this unit. Whereas the vacuole stops it from collapsing in on itself. Okay, so it stops the vacuole stops it from collapsing in, the cell wall prevents it from bursting out, so they're really there for the structure and stability of the cell. The chloroplasts, by contrast, have nothing really to do with the structure of the cell. Instead, they are super important for photosynthesis, and there's a reason I'm doing it in green. It's because the chemical inside called chlorophyll is green, and photosynthesis comes up in unit B4. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants use energy from the sun to react carbon dioxide and water, carbon dioxide that they're taking in through the holes in the leaf called the stomata, and the water through the roots through osmosis. We'll learn more about the stomata in unit B2. We'll look at osmosis in a later lesson in this unit, and they react those together using the energy from the light in the chloroplasts to make glucose, and glucose C6H12O6 is one of the most important chemicals in biology, particularly in GCSE biology. It's one of the only where you need to know the chemical formula, and it's going to come up again and again and again. Okay, so the chloroplasts are where photosynthesis happens. They are green. They have a chemical inside them called chlorophyll, and that chemical absorbs the light energy that's used to run the reaction of combining carbon dioxide and water. We're going to have a go now at drawing both of the cells. Don't worry if you're not a great drawer. I am a terrible drawer, as anybody who has come to one of my lessons and watched can attest to. Really what we're doing is we're looking more for just the layout of the cell. So we'll start with the animal cell, which I will do in a red outline. Animal cells are squishy. And then the plant cell on the right-hand side, which is traditionally a rectangle shape. So we'll label both of these. This is my animal cell. And this is my plant cell. We already have our cell membrane on our animal cell. That's the outer layer. The outer layer of a plant cell is the cell wall. And then just underneath the cell wall, you are going to have your cell membrane. Now, when you're looking at these under a microscope, and we'll look at some pictures of cells, some micrographs as they're called, pictures using a microscope, you can't see the cell membrane in a plant cell typically because it is so close to the cell wall. You can definitely see the cell wall, but not the cell membrane. We have the goop that's in the middle, which is the cytoplasm. So essentially, looks on the picture like the empty space. In a plant cell, we also have a large vacuole, the permanent vacuole we spoke about earlier. This contains the sap. We have the nucleus in both of them, which is always going to be a circle type shape. We have the mitochondria, which actually have a double membrane structure, so it's a terrible drawing. One membrane and then another one on the inside. The mitochondria there. We have the ribosomes, which are small circles. If you do A-level biology, you'll learn about the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The reason that the rough endoplasmic reticulum is rough is because it has the ribosomes studded on it. So for protein synthesis. Last but not least, we have the chloroplasts. Normally you would not use color in a biological diagram. I'm just adding it in green here to remind ourselves that it is green because of that lovely chemical inside called chlorophyll. So these are our chloroplasts. And that is an animal cell and a plant cell. Now, neither of them is very beautiful. However, if you got asked a question on an exam to diagram a plant cell or an animal cell and you labeled it as we have, you would get your full marks. Let's just make sure that line goes to the ribosome there. There's a reason that I've just done that. One of the classic mistakes that students make on a question like this is they rush through and they might do something, for example, saying, here is the nucleus, and then they'll draw their line, but they won't draw it the entire way. And you wouldn't get marks for that because you've actually labeled the cytoplasm, you haven't labeled the nucleus. Okay, so take your time. Don't throw easy marks away here. Make sure your lines are going to the correct place. Make sure that you have labeled things correctly. Let's move away from the artistic portion of the lesson and now consider what these cells are going to be doing in organisms and in organs. You can tell a lot about what an organism can do, or a tissue, or an organ. We'll see in Unit B2, it goes cells make up tissues, make up organs organ systems, make up organisms, based on the organelles that are found in those specialized cells that either make up the tissues, the organs, even the organism for really simple creatures. Okay? So, for example, what process can a plant do but an animal cannot? Should be really obvious from looking back at our diagram that there are certain organelles that plant cells have that animal cells don't, that therefore allow it to perform functions that an animal cell cannot perform. In biology, again and again and again, GCSE, A-level, university, it always comes back to structure and function, structure and function. If something has a certain structure, that will give it a certain function. If it doesn't have that structure, it's either going to have to find a different way to do that function or not be able to do that function at all. So 2 questions here then. Question 1, what process can plants do but animals cannot? Question 2, what evidence do you have to support your argument? Now, a bunch of you have already thought, oh, well, that's really obvious. Plants can do photosynthesis, but animals can't do photosynthesis. If you just wrote photosynthesis, though, you wouldn't get full marks here because you have to talk about that evidence to support your argument. Also really important, it's not just talking about plants, but it's also talking about animals. So you not only need to name the process, which I think we can all agree is photosynthesis, but you need to talk about why plants can do it and why animals cannot do it. If you just talk about why plants can do it, you wouldn't get full marks because you're not actually answering the question. The question includes why can't animals do it. So what might a model answer look like here? What can they do, plants do but animals can't? Photosynthesis, lovely. What evidence do you have to support your argument? Well, plant cells contain chloroplasts, which have the pigment chlorophyll within them that are necessary for photosynthesis. there's a mark. And then in terms of animals, animal cells do not have chloroplasts, so they cannot photosynthesize or do photosynthesis. So 3 marks. Give yourself a score out of 3. Give yourself a smiley face. Don't throw away marks on the easier questions. If you get a longer style question, a 4-mark question, a 6-mark question in an exam that asks you to compare things, so in this case we'll use the example of animals and plants, or animal cells and plant cells, you need to talk about 2 things. You need to talk about the similarities and you need to talk about the differences. Don't just talk about one or the other. And we're going to look at 2 ways that you can use to revise this or learn it, and then use those in an actual exam question to see how we can do. So the first one is through a table, and if you have the PowerPoint you can just print this out or you can copy it out by hand. But what I've done here is created a table for you with the names of the different organelles. There are 8 that we need to know, so nucleus, cell membrane, cell wall, mitochondria, cytoplasm, chloroplast, ribosome, and permanent vacuole. And all I want you to do in the table is indicate whether or not they are present in animal cells or plant cells or both. So for example, nucleus, animal cells have a nucleus, plant cells have a nucleus. Cell membrane, animal cells have a cell membrane, plant cells have a cell membrane. Have a go at the other ones here, just a simple tick box exercise. Those of you who end up doing the foundation paper, you may actually get a question that's almost identical to this, where you just have to tick things. If it is a higher question, then it's more likely that you'll have to write your answers in sentences, and we'll look at how to do that in a second. So have a go here at filling in the table. We'll go through the answers together in a second. Please do have a go. You're going to learn a lot more if you do things rather than just watch YouTube videos. That's too passive. You have to do something with the knowledge that you are acquiring. So here are the answers that I found. Plant cells have everything. Animal cells have everything except for a cell wall, chloroplasts, and a permanent vacuole. Another way of doing this, you could do this using a Venn diagram. So Venn diagrams are typically overlapping circles, 1 circle for each thing that you are comparing. In the overlapping parts of the circles, you write what they have in common, their similarities, and in the non-overlapping part of the circles, you write their differences, or what one thing has but the other one doesn't. So for example, here is an animal and plant cell Venn diagram. I've got the animal cells on the left, the plant cells on the right. And you can start filling it in. So for example, they both have nucleus, ribosome, cell membrane, cytoplasm, and mitochondria. Whereas the plant cell on its own is going to have cell wall, chloroplast, and a permanent vacuole. You'll notice the animal cell does not have anything that the plant cell doesn't. Now that's not entirely true. It's an oversimplification for GCSE. When you get into A-level biology, you'll see that animal cells actually have some organelles that plant cells don't have. So a different way of organizing the information. It has exactly the same information that we had on the table before, just presented in a slightly different way. Whatever works best for you, really. We can just look at some different ways of doing it. Now, applying that information in a possible exam question. Compare the structure of plant and animal cells. 4 marks. Not very many words for 4 marks. First thing we need to do is break down what the question's asking us to do. So we find our command word. We are comparing. That means similarities and differences. Not just one or the other. And then secondly, what are the things that we're comparing? We are comparing plant cells and animal cells. So in terms of similarities and differences, 2 similarities, 2 differences would most likely get you the marks here. 3 similarities, 1 difference. 3 differences, 1 similarity. Any combination of similarities and differences is going to get you the marks. So some sentence starters for you. Plant and animal cells both contain, and then you could pick any of the 5 things that we talked about before. So you could say, for example, a nucleus and cytoplasm. Use a different color here. Plant cells, however, contain chloroplasts and a cell wall. Now, if we just ended there, depending on the question, we might not actually get full marks because we have to talk about, again, just like we said before, we have to talk about plant cells and animal cells. So how can I finish this off? While animal cells do not. Okay, so really easy 4 marks there. If you only talked about similarities, you only talked about differences, you wouldn't get the full marks. And in our second sentence there, if you only referenced the plants but didn't mention the animal cells and the fact that they don't have those structures, then you would not get the marks. Okay, that's it for an intro then to animal and plant cells. Next lesson, lesson 2, is on eukaryotes and prokaryotes. We're going to build on what we've learned so far on animal and plant cells and bring in bacteria as well. Lesson 3, we're going to look at specialized cells. Lesson 4, we're going to look at how to calculate magnification and some of the maths that you need to do for this topic. But really nice introduction there. Links to a lot of different things in the GCSE biology spec. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you soon, or I guess speak to you soon for lesson 2. Bye-bye.